Great to have all of you here. It's been fascinating to see Ron White again. We met years ago at San Francisco Seminary, and it's just so interesting to hear how he is doing exegesis of American Scripture. And I'm not hearing any eisegesis. It's all exegesis. It's good. I just wanted to share a couple of quotes here from an article that I read not too long ago in History Today titled, "What Makes a Good Historian?" by Richard Wilkinson. Richard Wilkinson shows that good history is never dull, and he has two quotes here. "Your problem, Hugh, is that you ignore the documents." And the other quote is, "Your problem, Taylor, is that you ignore the facts." As Oxford's two finest historians locked horns in the full glare of the TV spotlights, their compadre Robert Key nervously tried to prevent a physical punch-up. While, however, Taylor and Trevor Roper disagreed about the merits of the recently published The Origins of the Second World War, and in parentheses is a quote, "Why has Mr. Taylor written such a bad book?" Trevor Roper had wondered in his encounter review, in parentheses, "They implicitly agreed that the truth matters above all, that indeed the truth is the only real priority for the good historian." One can go further and argue that Taylor and Trevor Roper together identified the two methods of establishing truth for a historian. Taylor's method, when writing his marvelously provocative and wrong-headed book, was to ferret out the documents and follow them where they led, or so he claimed. So far as Trevor Roper was concerned, when Taylor argued that Chamberlain and not Hitler caused the Second World War, he was perversely ignoring the relevant, clearly established, and blindingly obvious facts. So perhaps the good historian's job is to establish the relationship between documents and facts, and thus arrive at the truth. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a speaker who does not ignore either the documents or the facts and does arrive at the truth, and he is, in my wonderful way of putting it, a theological David McCullough of our time. I give you Ronald C. White.
Thank you, President Carl. Bill, I'll tell you these introductions. And I want to thank, I don't know, I heard he might be coming, but I think Sam Callion, is he in the house? Not yet. I think he recommended me for this several years ago. I was supposed to come last year and asked if I could come this year, but if you see Sam Callion, tell him thank you. Now, for those of you who are here for the first time, I said at the outset that there's so many different sides of Lincoln. Here he is. I just invoked your name. Hey, there's my friend Sam Callion. Sam, I think you got me into this. I was saying that there's so many different sides of Lincoln. We haven't really been able to open all of them up. Lincoln the lawyer, Lincoln the politician, really before he's the president. One I failed to open up, I want to do it right now. Lincoln the humorist. I think one of Lincoln's great gifts was the sense of humor, which some modern politicians would do well to follow. But Lincoln's humor wasn't like many night show television hosts. It wasn't hurtful. It wasn't at the expense of other people. He often laughed most at himself. I asked you in the first session this morning if you had seen the movie Lincoln, and many of you have. And in that movie, you may not have noticed, it didn't really tell you this remarkable friendship that developed between Lincoln and William Seward. Remember, William Seward, who had been governor and senator from New York, led on the first two ballots at the Republican convention in Chicago. He thought himself far more qualified than Abraham Lincoln. When Abraham Lincoln offered him the Secretary of State position, because Lincoln wanted people smarter than himself in the cabinet, what an enormously unusual way of leadership, having people smarter than yourself, Seward at first turned him down because his pride was hurt. But Lincoln convinced him to become Secretary of State, and so they began together. And after about 3 or 4 weeks, the New York Times had an op-ed that said, "We have no policy." Really a paper in Lincoln's corner normally, but very critical of Lincoln. So the next day, Seward wrote Lincoln a letter saying, in a sense, we have no policy. And in a posture that was not unusual for the 19th century, said, I think it's now my role to take the lead in formulating the policy of this administration. And Lincoln wrote a letter the next day, it was April Fool's, and he said, if it's all right with you, I think I will be the president. Well, Lincoln and Seward formed the most unusual friendship, so that by the end of May of that first year, Seward wrote a letter to his wife, who had stayed at her home in Auburn, New York, and he simply said to her, Lincoln is the best of all of us. Lincoln is the best of all of us. But what an unusual friendship. Lincoln would come out of his White House in the evening, they called it the Executive Mansion, walk across Lafayette Square to Seward's house. When he entered, Seward had this enormous liquor cabinet. Lincoln didn't drink. Seward, as you saw in the movie, smoked 15 to 18 to 20 cigars a day. Lincoln didn't smoke. Seward had a wonderful vocabulary of profanity. Lincoln didn't swear. But one day they were driving along in a buckboard. It was a very bumpy ride, and the driver was swearing a blue streak, and Lincoln touched him on the shoulder, and he said, my good man, are you an Episcopalian? And the driver, somewhat flustered, responded, well, no, I'm a Methodist. And he said, I thought you must be an Episcopalian. No, he said, you swear just like Mr. Seward does, and he's an Episcopal church warden. Well, we come now to the final time together, Lincoln's second inaugural address. I call it in my book Lincoln's greatest speech, no derogation to the Gettysburg Address, but Lincoln called it his best effort. He received a congratulatory letter on March 4, 1865, from Thurlow Weed, Republican politician, and he replied, I think it's my best effort. But then he added these lines, but it's not immediately popular. I get the first question today when we have our final question and comments, and it's a question to you. If Lincoln thought this was his best effort, why do you think he thought it was also not immediately popular? Here's a question to begin. How many of you have been to the Lincoln Memorial? Many, many people here. I want you to get in touch with maybe the first time you went or when you took children or grandchildren. When you arrive at the Lincoln Memorial, 36 columns, you walk up those steps and the first thing you see is the Daniel Chester French statue of Lincoln, 29 feet high. And when you get to the top in what I call that templed space, in a very noisy city, all of a sudden everybody is very quiet. You walk inside. Carved on one panel on the left in Indiana limestone is the Gettysburg Address. Carved on 3 panels is the Second Inaugural. Now we're going to be very interactive this afternoon. I want you to say in just 1 or 2 or 3 words, no sermons, what was your feeling or your experience when you were at the Lincoln Memorial? Anybody just call it out? Yes?
Awe and reverence.
Awe and reverence? Holy? Brought tears to your eyes? Dutiful? Goosebumps. Okay. Well, I think the word I've heard the most as I've asked this question is the word awe, or sometimes young people say awesome. When I was a student at UCLA, I sang in the a cappella choir. It was conducted by Roger Wagner, the founder of the Roger Wagner Chorale. It was an amazing experience. And in our junior year, we sang Bach's St. John's Passion. I recall it was so emotional that I was literally in tears when we got to the final chorale of that great work. And Wagner, a larger-than-life figure, when it was over, said, now next year we're going to do something more difficult. He said, we're going to do Beethoven's Missa Solemnis. About a week later, it dawned on me that as much as I enjoyed the music, how awesome it was, I didn't really understand it. And so the next year, I decided I would sign up for 2 classes for non-music majors, one on Bach and one on Beethoven. So my delight is to talk to people who are awestruck by Lincoln, but hopefully to bring a little more understanding. We may think he is the greatest president. I think he's our most eloquent president. Certainly, as I talked to you about the German constituency that I spoke to in Hamburg, they thought he was the most amazing American. So for those who have joined us for this session, what we've been doing is looking at Lincoln's 3 speeches, what I call American scripture. And thank you, Bill, that was very good. What I'm trying to do is to exegete those speeches, even as we would try to exegete scripture. And I've had a particular interest thinking of this audience and those alums who have come back to this great seminary. Today, I especially want to lift up the minister, who I think is the unsung person in the Lincoln story, Phineas Densmore Gurley, Lincoln's pastor at the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. He doesn't appear in any biographies, but he does in mine, because I think he is such an absolutely essential figure in our ability to understand what Lincoln finally says in the Second Inaugural. Let's look at it together now. This is only 701 words. Second shortest inaugural ever offered. George Washington offered the briefest. He didn't want to run for a second term. There was no tradition. We were not yet in Washington, D.C. And I like to say that Washington stood and in 135 words said, "Thank you very much," and sat down. We're used to inaugural addresses that go on 35, 40, 45, 50, 55 minutes. As an historian, I want to first of all place this in its historical context. Anybody here been to an inauguration? Oh, great, we have some people. I've not, but I've watched them on television. They're very celebratory events, especially if it's your candidate. And so that's what I expected in the crowd that would come. Oh, here's the extra credit question. Let's see how much you know your American history. Who was the last president before Lincoln to be inaugurated for a second term? Yes, Andrew Jackson. Oh, you get a gold star. Very good, wonderful. So this was an extremely unusual event in and of itself. People would run for presidency. James Polk ran saying, "I will not run for a second term." So that had become the expectation. So I expected that the people who would be there that day, 25 to 35,000 people, it was a terribly rainy, muddy, windy day, would be in a celebratory mood. So I read their diaries and their letters, and I discovered something quite different. Many of the people there that day were deeply angry. Angry. Why would they be angry? Because if you think about it, probably every person there had lost a father, husband, son, brother, and they were deeply angry towards the South, and we want our leaders to express our anger. In World War I, we've just finished that commemoration. We banished the teaching of German in all of the public schools in the United States. In World War II, we banished the Japanese from the West Coast of the United States. That's what we do in times of war. So people come with their own expectation. They're still settling in when Lincoln's finished, because he only takes about 6.5 minutes to deliver this address. Oh, I should say that the audience there was notable in 2 different ways, especially. The soldiers were present in great number. But people wrote about those soldiers because Civil War surgery was marked by amputation. 3/4 of Civil War surgery was amputation. And so the sight of these soldiers with amputated leg and amputated arm just was shocking to people. And then the other group was there, the Times of London reporters. Sometimes when you stand outside your own culture, you really get a sense of what's going on. He noticed this immediately. There was a group of people huddled in the back. He thought they'd never been to an inauguration before. Most people, because it was a drab day, were dressed in their dark clothing. These people were dressed in bright clothing, red, blue. African Americans were huddled at the back of the inauguration. So Lincoln begins. At this second appearing to take the oath of the presidential office, there is less occasion for an extended address than there was at the first. Well, this is not exactly 77 years ago. There's nothing in this first sentence that sort of grabs our attention. We're not exactly sure where Lincoln is going in this first paragraph. May I suggest, as we steel ourselves for the upcoming presidential campaign season, that Lincoln breaks every rule of modern politics and modern leadership studies. Modern leaders are going to tell us everything they're going to do for us, all the positive things that are out there. Lincoln takes exactly the opposite approach. Listen. At this second appearing to take the oath of the presidential office, there is less occasion for an extended address. 7 lines down over on the right-hand side, little that is new could be presented. Second line from the end of the first paragraph, no prediction in regard to it is ventured. What an unusual way to begin an address. In the second paragraph, we begin to get a sense as to what Lincoln is doing, where he is going. I suggest he's asking a question that no one else is really asking, not the politicians, not the preachers, not the professors. This is his question: how can the South be brought back into the Union? And he understands that if the South is meant to bear the shame and the blame alone, they will never be brought back into the Union. So his first rhetorical strategy is the use of what I call inclusive language. Inclusive language. Listen. On the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it. All sought to avert it. Towards the end of the paragraph, both parties deprecated war. Lincoln, you see, is imputing the best possible motives to the supposed enemy, the people of the South. Wouldn't our political campaigning be totally different if we imputed the best possible motives to the person with whom we disagreed? We could disagree over ideas, but not motives. As we wish to share the Christian faith, is it not our posture to come to the person with imputing to them the best possible motives? This is the way Lincoln begins. Aha! But the first time I ever offered this presentation was at the United States Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. And wouldn't you know it, there was a Princeton PhD in English in the audience, a professor there, and he immediately challenged me. He said, "Dr. White, don't you notice at the end of the second paragraph that Lincoln actually says both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish?" And so the professor said, "Isn't he actually blaming the South?" I think we need to learn to listen to what people do not say, what politicians do not say, what professors do not say, what ministers decide not to say. So what would have happened if Lincoln would have said it this way? Both parties deprecated war, but those traitors, those tyrants, those Confederates, those rebels, why, the crowd would have erupted in applause. I think he very self-consciously chose the generic word, but one of them, to tone down the emotion. Earlier, Mr. Lincoln, I think it was, referred us to, after the victory at Gettysburg, Lee took his troops limping back to the Potomac to get across into Virginia. And Lincoln became absolutely furious as day after day after day after day, General George Meade did not go after Lee. What's the matter with you? Finally, about 12 days later, Lee finally took off. He caught up. The Potomac was flooded, and Lee couldn't cross. But finally, when he got to the Potomac, the flood was gone, and the last troop crossed into Virginia to prolong the war for certainly another year, and Meade had done nothing to stop it. Lincoln sat at his desk, and he wrote with deep anger, "Do you understand what you have done? Do you understand what the opportunity you have let?" And on and on and on and on. And in the Lincoln papers, there is this remarkable letter to George Meade. And on the envelope, it simply says, "Never signed, never sent." Never signed, never sent. For Abraham Lincoln understood that if he would have sent that letter, he would have destroyed George Meade, who had won, after all, the victory at Gettysburg. Have you ever wished you didn't send that email? It's more difficult today. The idea that sometimes we don't have to say those vociferous words, Lincoln understood that clearly. The second paragraph also demonstrates Lincoln's wonderful rhetorical artistry and use of language. One of my sort of subtexts today is the wonderful use of language. I'm terribly concerned with what's happening to language. For Lincoln, words really matter. Do they still matter today to us? One of his great gifts, and ministers use this gift, is the gift of alliteration. And here's an extra credit question. Who can tell me what is the definition of alliteration? Use of the same consonant, right? Over and over and over again. Let's listen. On the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it, all sought to avert it. While the inaugural address was being delivered from this place, devoted altogether to saving the Union without war, insurgent agents were in the city seeking to destroy it without war, seeking to dissolve the Union and divide effects by negotiation. I once asked this question in a church group in Phoenix, Arizona, and there were two 13-year-old girls sitting in the front row, and I think they just studied this in school, and the one girl, she literally leapt out of her seat to give me the right answer, and as I was starting to explain this, the other girl jumped up, and she said, "Do you mean to tell me that Abraham Lincoln decided in advance to use the consonant D 8 times in the second paragraph?" I said, "No, I don't think so." But what I said earlier this morning was he had a sense for the sound of words, the sound of words. And what does alliteration do for you and me, the listener? Well, ministers sometimes use it in their three-point sermons. It helps organize our thought. It's something that we can memorize quite quickly. It's kind of an invisible thread that pulls all of these ideas together. By invisible, I mean we may not even be conscious of it, but it's helping us. And then sometimes, almost like a crescendo in music, it often builds, this paragraph builds toward the end. Well, towards the end, another of Lincoln's rhetorical strategies is he, as I suggested with the Gettysburg Address, he often will use one word over and over and over again. It's an idea embodied in a word. What is the word in the second paragraph? Not the word all, but the noun. It's what everybody's talking about when they come to the Second Inaugural. It is the word war. 7 times as a noun, twice as a pronoun. Lincoln had come to an understanding that we have, I think, maybe still not fully understood. The North began this war believing they would win this war quickly, within 3, 4, 6 months. They had far more men in arms than the South, a far greater industrial base, a much larger population to draw upon. But the war went on and on and on. The war achieved a life of its own. When I spoke that day in Colorado Springs, my guide, my host, was a Marine captain who told me in one afternoon in Vietnam he was wounded 38 times. He then went on to become a military chaplain with an MDiv degree and a PhD in philosophy. This was before the beginning of the war in Iraq. And he said to me that day in words I didn't fully grasp at the time, he said, "Ron, when the next war comes, we will be told by our government and by our military leaders that we will win this war quickly because we are the greatest military in the world," which we are. He said, "Do not believe it. The next war will go on and on and on and on and on, and it will spin right out of our control." This is what Lincoln understood. And so when he gets to the last sentence, he does an amazing turnabout. It's an incredible sentence. It's 4 words and 4 syllables, and the war came. Do you hear it? Up till now, war had been the direct object, both grammatically and historically, of the actions of the soldiers, the generals, and of Lincoln as commander-in-chief. But now in the last sentence, war is suddenly the subject of the sentence. It has a life of its own that cannot be controlled even by the commander-in-chief. And he offers this last sentence. I wondered how Lincoln said that sentence. We have 9 photographs of him delivering the Second Inaugural. We don't have any audio. And so I wondered, and I thought to myself, well, maybe Edward Everett, who we talked about earlier this afternoon, was the great orator of the 19th century, a very kind of high-toned oratory. I think he might have said it something like, "And the war came." But I don't think Lincoln said it that way at all. How do you think Lincoln might have said that final sentence of the second paragraph? Quietly, yes. Anything else? Pause. Sadly, mournfully, 750,000 dead in a tiny nation of little more than 30 million people? I don't know how he said it, but I can imagine he might have said something like, "And the war came." No cause for great triumph at that moment. The third paragraph is Lincoln's attempt, I think, almost as an historian or a chronicler, to kind of chronicle the meaning of the war. Interestingly, in March of 2011, as we were preparing to commence the commemoration, the 4-year commemoration of the Civil War, the Pew Charitable Trust did a survey of Americans. And the key question was, what do you think is the cause of the Civil War? Oh my goodness, the varied answers that were given. Only one group, 65 and older, answered slavery. The group 18 to 29 was all over the map in terms of what they thought the cause of the Civil War was. Let's listen to Lincoln. 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. That evening, in April of 2011, on the PBS NewsHour, they had 3 historians, including a white historian from the University of South Carolina, and he simply said, "Read the secession documents. Read the secession documents." Of course it was about slavery. Whatever else people have wanted to say. I've had people tell me all kinds of different reasons for the cause of the Civil War. Lincoln says very clearly what it was. To strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents, we use that word today, would rend the Union, even by war, while the government claimed no right to do more than to restrict the territorial enlargement of it. Neither party expected for the war the magnitude or the duration which it's already attained. Neither anticipated that the cause of the conflict, slavery, might cease with or even before the conflict itself should cease. Each side looked for an easier triumph and a result less fundamental and astounding. Do you hear Lincoln's inclusive language even here? Even when he says each side, he's recognizing the motives of different people and not criticizing either. And now I suggest Lincoln makes a dramatic change. Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God. When I began my study of Lincoln, I thought, I'm a Johnny-come-lately. I'm coming pretty late to this. So I deferred to some of my academic colleagues, and they said, well, don't get too excited about that kind of religious language. Of course, that's in all the previous inaugural addresses. So I thought, okay, I'll look at the previous 18 inaugural addresses before Abraham Lincoln. I was surprised by what I found. Every one of them mentioned God or some name for God, but always only in the last paragraph. And we need God's help too. Only once in those 18 addresses was the Bible ever quoted. John Quincy Adams. If the Lord builds the house, those who labor build it in vain. Lincoln in the second inaugural will mention God 14 times, quote the Bible 4 times, and invoke prayer 3 times. Now, the point isn't to count up these things, but to ask ourselves, what is the meaning? Well, first of all, we need to see that the language both read the same Bible is inclusive. He's saying to a northern audience, please remember the southern people read the Bible every bit as much as you do. The Confederate soldiers read the Bible every bit as much as you do. A surprising source of my research for the Second Inaugural was to go to the American Bible Society in New York and find all of these Union and Confederate Bibles. The American Bible Society went into overdrive. They were working 24 hours a day, and they discovered rather quickly that a soldier, an infantryman, couldn't be carrying a Bible around, so they published 14 different versions, smaller editions, Romans, Psalms, Galatians, John, whatever, that soldiers carried with them. But after this affirmation, we have a semicolon. One of my worries about language is that it's getting dropped out. I was speaking several years ago at a boys' school in Nashville, Tennessee, and the headmaster said to me, Ron, he said, we cannot hand out a handout to 700 boys. Can you imagine what's going to happen while you're trying to speak? He said, why don't we just put the text up on the screen behind you? And I thought, well, that sounds fairly a good idea. I could work with that. He said, I'll give you a pointer, with light. So I turned around. I was shocked. I discovered no more semicolons, no more dashes, and the word came was no longer a sentence. Someone had modernized Abraham Lincoln's grammar, spelling, punctuation. I said, I'm not doing that again. I'll risk the boys going like that. So what is the semicolon? How does it function for Lincoln? It's often a signpost to the reader that he's about to go in a very different direction. Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, semicolon, and each invokes his aid against the other should really be read. How dare each side invoke God's aid against the other? Is this a tribal God? Is it a territorial God? One day when a delegation of ministers and politicians were visiting Lincoln, when they told him this, God is on our side, God bless America, he leapt up from them and said, pardon me, I would like to figure out how I can get to be on God's side. And then he invokes his first passage of Scripture from Genesis. It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. I tried to find the antecedent of this address. If you look, say, for example, at Martin Luther King's great I Have a Dream speech, you can find that he used portions of that in earlier times, not unusual for a speaker. Something works well, you put it together, a different combination, and use it some other place. I couldn't find any other instances of Lincoln ever using these words in a speech. However, I did find one interesting antecedent. 3 months to the day before he delivered this, 2 women came to see Lincoln. The word was out that Lincoln hated what he called Butcher's Day. That was the day once a week when the generals send him the letter to execute this person for falling asleep, failing to fight, not being a sentry. Lincoln wrote back one day to one of the generals, I think this man will do better above ground than below ground. He went on to win the Congressional Medal of Honor. But these women, their husbands were Confederate officers confined to a Union prison. And they said to Lincoln, our husbands are religious men. So Lincoln listened to them, and then to the consternation of his secretaries, he drove them crazy. He said, would you come back tomorrow? Let's continue the conversation. So after the second day, he invited these women to come back for a third day. And they kept talking. And then Lincoln said to them, I find it very difficult when you tell me that your husbands are religious men. How can religious men go against the duly constituted authority of this country? And then he said, I'm sure from memory, it may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. Genesis 3:19. What Lincoln is saying to us and to them and to us, I don't have it in my hand, but the Bible is not simply back there and then. It is here and now. Your husbands are involved in what? Slavery. That's how they're wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. And then he said to these 2 astonished women, I don't think that's the kind of religion that gets people to heaven. And he asked them to leave. Now, Noah Brooks of the Sacramento Daily Union was sitting out in the parlor, and he asked Noah Brooks to come in. Brooks would have become his secretary in the second term. And he said, I kind of like this conversation. Let's write this down. I think I might want to use it someday. He did. But then there's another semicolon. But let us judge not, that we be not judged. I think Lincoln may have thought to himself, that was quite harsh with those two women, and so he changes the tone completely and he invokes who? Jesus, Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 7. Those who might cede some religious faith to Lincoln often want to make him an Old Testament character. I've asked often, does Lincoln ever mention Jesus? Yes, he does. And here he invokes the Sermon on the Mount as really the basis of his whole Second Inaugural. Instead of a policy of judgment and recrimination against the South, I want to offer a policy of forgiveness and reconciliation, which is really based and modeled in Jesus and his Sermon on the Mount. And the audience would have understood this because they knew their Bibles. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purposes. This is the central sentence architecturally in the address. I think it's the central sentence theologically in the address. Lincoln has moved so far forward from deism or fatalism or whatever you want to call it. This address is all about providence. We will turn shortly to where does that belief come from. But this is a statement that God does act in history. Lincoln loved the term Almighty for God. I was speaking in a church in Southern California several years ago, and they asked me to come and meet with the leadership, the elders, Saturday night before. I said, okay, I can do that. And on the way out from dinner, the associate minister said to me, by the way, she said, you wouldn't mind giving the children's sermon too tomorrow. And in a moment I should not have done, I said, oh, sure. So I forgot about it. So we're walking into the church service for the first service on Sunday morning, and she nudges me and says, you are going to give the children's sermon. Oh my gosh, I was so nervous. I was so worried. I could give the adult sermon, but I was so anxious. What would I say to these children? So I told them this story, that Noah Brooks from Sacramento arrived in Washington. He had met Lincoln once before in Illinois, and he decided to go to the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, where he knew Lincoln attended, and he sat up on the balcony, and he did what you shouldn't do. When the minister said, let us pray, Noah Brooks opened his eyes and looked ahead. And he noticed that all of these devout Presbyterians had their heads bowed and their hands folded, except one. And this man, 6 feet 4 inches tall, was standing. And so after the service, Brooks, I don't know how he did this, but he said, sir, I happened to notice that you were standing during the pastoral prayer. Could I ask you? Oh, he said, yes. He said, I stood as a mark of respect. God is the Almighty, and I stand with my head bowed as a mark of respect. So I told the children this story at the end of it. When the service is over, I'm standing out there greeting someone, and the Sunday school teacher comes rushing up to me. She just finished children's church. She said, you'll never guess what happened. I said, what happened? Well, when I said to the children, let us pray, they said, let's stand up, let's stand up, let's stand up. The Almighty has his own purposes. But now there's one more change, and it's even more dramatic. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come. But woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. Friends, if I could say something to you respectfully, inaugural addresses are efforts of self-congratulation. We don't want this kind of language in our inaugural addresses. So Thomas Jefferson in his second inaugural says something like, well, thank you very much for electing me a second term. I know you realize what a great job I did the first term. But there are also efforts of national self-congratulation. We are the greatest country. We don't have any problems. We are wonderful. We are perfect. We are terrific. And Abraham Lincoln dares to sound like the audience would have understood a Puritan preacher preaching a Jeremiad. In the second and third generation in New England, the preachers waged war against these people, saying, you have forgotten the faith of your parents and grandparents. And then the question becomes, well, what is the offense? And Lincoln quickly answers, if we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which in the providence of God must needs come, but which having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and he gives to both North and South this terrible war, as the woe due to those by whom the offense came, shall we discern any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him? If we shall suppose that American slavery, if he would have said, if we shall suppose that slavery, the audience would have assumed that he was criticizing the South. But when he says American slavery, he's saying we're all responsible for this problem. Lincoln dares to say to this audience, we, the American family, have endured for all these years a great evil in our midst. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, alliteration again, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. On that Sunday after Fort Sumter, we have Phineas Densmore Gurley's sermon, and he talked about the mighty scourge of war. He used the exact same word that Lincoln is now using here. Yet if God wills that it continue, until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk. Well, you're listening outdoors, it's cold, windy, and rainy, you have to think 250. My goodness, he's saying this started right at the beginning of our nation. Until every drop of blood drawn with a lash. This is my suggestion of Lincoln's development as a speaker. His first inaugural is very rational, very thoughtful, very lawyerly. Now he's become a much more evocative speaker, willing to use emotional images and language. Till unrequited toil, unrequited, the slaves didn't gain anything from it, till every drop of blood drawn with a lash shall be paid with another drawn by the sword, 750,000 dead. As was said 3,000 years ago, and now he quotes Psalm 19, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. Now the reporter for the Times of London, watching this whole thing, noting in his report that there had been up till now only 4 occasions of applause, how unusual for an inaugural address, thought he heard something. It wasn't applause, but it was coming from the back of the audience, and he strained his ear to listen. And yes, he did hear it, and he began to hear, bless the Lord, bless the Lord. The African Americans in the crowd took up the chant, bless the Lord, bless the Lord, bless the Lord. They understood what Abraham Lincoln was talking about. Frederick Douglass, the greatest African American in the 19th century, was in the crowd that day. He'd been terribly disappointed in Lincoln's inaugural address. He wasn't there that day. He was reading it in Rochester, New York. Lincoln had said in that address, trying to hold an olive branch out to the South, I will retain the fugitive slave law, a terrible law by which people could come into the North and regain their slave. But Douglass had met Lincoln twice in the intervening years. He'd become deeply impressed. I think he was a mentor to Lincoln. And so he came that day out of curiosity. He looked around. He noticed that people weren't exactly sure what he was saying. But he wrote, Douglass did in his diary that evening, this was not a state paper. It sounded almost like a sermon. Almost like a sermon. The next day, a reporter would write, this was Lincoln's Sermon on the Mount. But another reporter said, sounded like the tale of an old sermon. And another reporter wrote, he's crossed the line between church and state. Where have we heard that before? If this is a sermon, it's not a sermon, but it's like a sermon. Let me make this suggestion, which I think most of you will fully understand. I'm suggesting that sermons in the 19th century, and perhaps today, really have 2 basic parts, what I would call the indicative and the imperative. The indicative is where the minister announces to us that in the life, teaching, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, salvation has come. Or in God leading his people through the Red Sea. This is God's act of salvation. This is the indicative. This is the pronouncement. This is the gospel. But I don't know about your minister, depending on where you are. My minister gets a little more folksy on Sunday morning when he comes to the imperative, in which he sort of says something like, and therefore, in the coming week, I think I ask you to be what? More forgiving, more reconciling, more generous, more caring. That's the imperative. So Lincoln is now coming to the imperative. I think he asked himself the question, he had to ask himself the question, in this deeply divided nation, is it possible to ask for forgiveness and reconciliation? And although Lincoln is an historical figure, I think we have to ask ourselves today, in this deeply divided nation in which our children are growing up, in which we are growing now, is it possible to ask for forgiveness and reconciliation? Lincoln is an historical figure, but somehow I say to students, he's that one person of very few whose words still speak across time, who still have healing in them. So I'm going to suggest as we close now, and we'll transition into a time of questions and comments, I want to say more about Phineas Dinsmore Gurley, that we say the last paragraph out loud together. Lincoln spoke very slowly. You and I speak about 150 words per minute. He spoke only about 115 words a minute. If you speak more slowly, without amplification, you will be better heard. So I think these words speak across time. Let's say it together. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and a lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Thank you.